I think, they're connected not directly, but by the fact that there are these underlying kind of structural problems. If we think about migration and mass migration, I mean, migration, people's attitudes to migration are still very much filtered and shaped along broadly left-right axes. What's particularly true is that, most of the anti-migration or the grounds of anti-migration stuff was not laid by right-wing populist parties. It was laid by ordinary centre-right parties. So over the last 30 years, at least since the late 1980s, we've seen European centre-right parties typically taking harder lines on migration and using migration as a political issue to differentiate themselves from the liberal social democratic side, and to kind of appeal, not least to classical voters for social democratic parties, i.e. to, typically kind of white working class communities, but also to, their broader normal audience. So it's important to recognise the sense in which the sort of centre-right parties and their, as it were, migration policies actually kind of laid the basis for the far-right populist parties, created the conditions that could be exploited by those parties. The sort of liberal social democratic parties have tended to have a much more kind of mixed relationship to migration, being on the one hand, wanting to kind of support human rights, wanting to kind of support, the rights of migrants in communities, but on the other hand, wanting to kind of control and regulate migration. So the move and the push to having a common European asylum system, for example, was out of the recognition that it would become there was a potential source of tension between states, and the ability of particular states to control refugee flows would be a problem for European politics. So from 1997 and the meeting in Tampere through to the kind of essentially the launch of the common European asylum scheme in 2015, I think, roughly, there was this kind of concern with trying to kind of regulate that movement. Unfortunately, a core part of that regime, which was the Dublin Convention, which said that asylum seekers should be registered in the first European country to which they come, had the effect of putting massive burdens on those countries of immediate entry, most notably Greece, Italy, and to a certain extent Hungary, and not, as it were, supporting fair distribution across the European Union. So that met with different reactions in the different states. Okay, Hungary basically, under Orban, said no, we don't want this, and started erecting fences, busing people through to other places, setting up a kind of asylum hunting border unit. Greece, on the other hand, under a kind of more left-wing government, took people in and has been basically, begging for support in this, in dealing with this flow. Italy registered some people very slowly, but basically turned a blind eye to people moving out of Italy, often heading towards Germany. And what's happened here in the EU, and this is a serious problem for the EU, is exactly the same as what we saw in the financial crisis, which is the moment that you get a mass pressure of this kind, things divert back to national interests. Things divert back to the interests of the particular states rather than, as it were, kind of solidarity across states. So Europe, for which solidarity is a fundamental value embedded in pretty much all the treaties of the EU from the beginning to the most recent, is not being adequately institutionalized within the EU in ways that kind of prevent or limit it going straight back to the priority of national politics. Because, you know, the leaders of these states are not elected by European publics. They're elected by national publics. So when push comes to shove, that's the audience, you know, who hold them accountable and to whom they are going to look. So there's a question about how do you reform the EU in order to support solidarity? Particularly in this case, how do you reform the European Common Asylum regime in a way that supports solidarity? And while, you know, the Commission's been working very hard on this, there's the key sticking factor is working out a system of fair distribution that states will accept. And of course the Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, you know, and others are deeply opposed to a kind of quota system that would require them to take in particular groups. So there are all sorts of innovative ways people have proposed for looking at that, but there is a kind of core solidarity problem that the EU has to face in this area and in other areas. And that, it seems to me, is going to need, as it were, institutional reconfiguration of the EU. Maybe the shift to European-wide political parties in the European Parliament, away from coalitions made up of national political parties. So, as it were, transnational political parties in the EU. That lots of people who know more about this than I have, you know, other ideas. But the problem is there and needs to be addressed.